Okay, this is our regular Language of the Heart meeting. My name is Jim. I am an alcoholic. This is a meeting of the Stairway Group of Alcoholics Anonymous, which we study various selections from the book Language of the Heart. Tonight we're going to be taking a look at an article Bill wrote about the writing of the 12 steps. Very interesting, very important article. Please join me in a moment of silent meditation. We'll say the Serenity Prayer together. Thank you. Serenity Prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. And Alcoholics Anonymous is a fellowship of men and women who share their experience, strength, and hope with each other. They may solve their common problem and help others recover from alcoholism. The only requirement for membership is the desire to stop drinking. There are no dues or fees for AA membership. We're self-supporting to our own contributions. And AA is not alive with any sect, denomination, politics, organization, or institution, not wish to engage in any controversy, neither endorses nor opposes any causes. Our primary purpose is to stay sober, help other alcoholics to achieve sobriety. The primary purpose of an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting is the teaching and practice of the 12 steps. Tom, would you read chapter 5 for us tonight, please? Let's follow along with Tom on page 58.
Rare day we see a person fail with a silly collar pack. Those who not recover, people cannot or will not completely give themselves a simple program. Usually men and women who are constitutionally incapable of being honest with themselves. Are such unfortunate to not fall but seem to have been born that way. They are naturally incapable of grasping and developing a manner of living which demands rigorous honesty. Their chances are less than average. There are those too who suffer from grave emotional and mental disorders, but many of them do recover if they have the capacity to be honest. Our stories disclose in a general way what we used to be like, what happened, and what we're like now. If you've decided you want what we have and are willing to go anything to get it, then you're ready to take certain steps. Now, some of these we bought. We thought we could find easier, softer ways, but we could not. Because in earnestness of our command, we beg of you, throw some thorough from the very start. Some of us have tried to hold on to old ideas, and the result was none to let God slip. Remember we do with alcohol, counting back to powerful. God knows there's too much for us. There is one who has all power, and one is God, and He finds Him now. After maybe the result is nothing. This is the turning point. We ask for protection and care for the abandoned. Here are the steps we took, which are suggested as a program recovery. When we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, lives had become manageable. 2. Came to believe that our power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. 3. Made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood Him. 4. Made searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. 5. Admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. 6. We're entirely ready to have God remove all the defects of character. 7. Humbly asking to remove our shortcomings. 8. Made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. 9. Made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. 10. Continue to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admit it. 11. Sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood Him, praying only for the knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out. Step 12. Having had a spiritual awakening and resolved these steps, we tried to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all our affairs. And they must exclaim, "What an order, I can't get through this." Do not be discouraged. No one among us has been able to maintain anything like perfect adherence to these principles. We're not saints. The point is that we want to go along spiritual lines. The principles we have set down are guides to progress. We claim spiritual progress rather than spiritual perfection. Our description of the alcoholic, the chapter agnostic, and our personal adventures before and after make clear 3 pertinent ideas. A. That we were alcoholics and could not manage our own lives. B. That probably no human power could have relieved our alcoholism. And C. That God could and would if we were sorry.
Thank you very much, Tom. Okay, we're going to be working with an article which starts on page 195 called A Fragment of History, Origin of the 12 Steps. Let's begin on page 195. The bottom of the page. AAs are always asking, where did the 12 steps come from? In the last analysis, perhaps nobody knows. Yet some of the events which led to their formulation are as clear to me as though they took place yesterday. And by the way, at one time Bill was asked, where did AA program come from? And he said, nobody invented AA, it just grew by the grace of God. Then he goes on to tell us that his main inspirations came from the Oxford groups, from Dr. Silkworth, and from William James. Now let's go over to page 200. Let's set the stage a little bit. Bill had been asked to write the big book, that's what they eventually named it, but to write the book sometime in the latter part of 1938. And he had commenced to write it, and he had finished the first 4 chapters. He was beginning to write the 5th chapter, and he came to that place where he wrote, here are the steps we took which are suggested as a program of recovery. And he stopped there because he didn't know for sure what to write. And let's see what he had to work with. Page 200, the first full paragraph. Dr. Silkworth had indeed supplied us the missing link, without which the chain of principles now forged in our 12 steps could never have been complete. We need to know what that missing link is. We talked about it tonight in the first meeting. But Dr. Silkworth had made it clear to Bill that he was going to have to use the sledgehammer of the disease and its fatality and incurability if he was to get through to the practicing alcoholic. And he was going to have to be willing to make sure that the new person understood that he was in fact an alcoholic, or that anyone who was carrying the message knew what they were talking about. In other words, to establish credibility and to utilize the disease as a sledgehammer to complete the process of reaching the bottom, so that the person would be willing to go to work. Now, Bill is saying here that advice was a missing link, that then and there the spark that was to become Alcoholics Anonymous had been struck. During the next 3 years after Dr. Bob's recovery, our growing groups at Akron, New York, and Cleveland evolved the so-called word-of-mouth program of our pioneering time. Notice that the 12 steps did not exist in any written form, nor did the 6 steps of the Oxford group, that this was all word of mouth. In other words, when Bill was writing the big book, the 12 steps had never been written down, and they had evolved by word of mouth and by experimentation and by trial and error. As we commenced to form a society separate from the Oxford group, we began to state our principles something like this. Remember that the Oxford group principles, there were 6 in number, and the 6 principles that AA began to use read this way. 1, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol. Now, of course, that powerlessness over alcohol wasn't any part of the Oxford 6 steps. 2, we got honest with ourselves. 3, we got honest with another person in confidence. Now, getting honest with ourselves, in part, of course, involves the 4th step. And remember, at this time, the business of writing out the steps was not anything that the Oxford group did. It was something that our guys were beginning to realize needed to be done. We had to get it out of our heads and down on paper. So the idea of a written inventory was evolving up to the point where Bill was about to write the steps. We got honest with another person in confidence. This was a direct result of the Oxford group, and it's an ancient principle. We find it in the Bible. We find it in many religious writings. The principle being that we must confess or admit our wrongs or our sins or whatever you want to call them to another person. That this is of enormous spiritual significance. And so the Oxfordians had picked up on it. They were trying to practice first century Christianity, and it worked so well that this became really the hallmark of recovery for AA. One, that we make a decision to turn our will over to God, and two, that we tell our full story. So this business of admitting to another person became really of tremendous importance in recovery. And it still is, of course, today. 4, we made amends for harms done to others. Now, this business of making amends they also got from the Oxford group. The Oxfordians had recognized, as we do today, that we had to be freed from our guilts in order for us to draw close to God. 5, we worked with other alcoholics without demand for prestige or money, which is then translated into the 12th step. And 6, we prayed to God to help us do these things as best we could, which roughly corresponds to our 11th step. These principles were advocated according to the whim or liking of each of us, and that would be natural, where it's all word of mouth stuff. Just look at the diversity of opinion about these things around the rooms right now. Think if we didn't have the 12 steps written down, what kind of a mishmash we'd be dealing with. And though in Akron and Cleveland they still stuck to the OG absolutes of honesty, purity, unselfishness, and love. Now it's important to understand what they're saying here. That OG believed once you worked their steps that you acquired absolute honesty, absolute purity, absolute unselfishness, and absolute love. And our guys found out that just simply wasn't so. That's why in chapter 5 it tells us that we're not saints. We don't claim any kind of spiritual perfection. We claim only spiritual progress. This was the gist of our message to incoming alcoholics up to 1939, when our present 12 steps were put to paper. So you can see that what Bill was dealing with here was something which existed only out there as a very diverse word-of-mouth program, and it was up to him to pull this all together and to put it into some kind of form that, and as he says, we wanted to make sure that alcoholics, being as we are, could not mistake what the message was, that there would be no wiggle room left whatsoever. And that's the way he wrote the steps. I well remember the evening on which the 12 steps were written. I was lying in bed quite dejected and suffering from one of my imaginary ulcer attacks. 4 chapters of the book Alcoholics Anonymous had been roughed out and read in meetings at Akron and New York. We quickly found that everybody wanted to be an author. The hassles as to what should go into our new book were terrific. For example, some wanted a purely psychological book which would draw in alcoholics without scaring them. We still hear a lot about that today. We could tell them about the God business afterwards. A few, led by our wonderful Southern friend Fritz M., wanted a fairly religious book infused with some dogmas we had picked up from the churches and missions, which had tried to help us. The louder these arguments, the more I felt in the middle. It appeared I wasn't going to be the author after all. I was only going to be an umpire who would decide the contents of the book. This didn't mean, though, that there wasn't terrific enthusiasm for the undertaking. Every one of us was wildly excited at the possibility of getting our message before all those countless alcoholics who still didn't know. Having arrived at chapter 5, it seemed high time to state what our program really was. And Bill's saying, what we have, the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, is 12 steps. And anything else is peripheral to that. I remember running over in my mind the word-of-mouth phrases then in current use. Jotting these down, they added up to the 6 above. Then came the idea that our program ought to be more accurately and clearly stated. Distant readers would have to have a precise set of principles. Knowing the alcoholic's ability to rationalize, something airtight would have to be written. We couldn't let the reader wiggle out anywhere. Besides, a more complete statement would help in the chapters to come, where we would need to show exactly how the program of recovery ought to be worked. That's all pretty clear, isn't it? I mean, there's no equivocation here. And neither is there equivocation in the big book. Here it goes. At length I began to write on a cheap yellow tablet. I split the word-of-mouth program up into smaller pieces, meanwhile enlarging its scope considerably. Uninspired as I felt, I was surprised that in a short time, perhaps half an hour, I had set down certain principles which, on being counted, turned out to be 12 in number. And for some unaccountable reason, I had moved the idea of God into the second step, right up front. Besides, I had named God very liberally throughout the other steps. In one of the steps, I had even suggested that the newcomer get down on his knees. That was in the 7th step. It originally was written humbly on our knees, asking to remove our shortcomings. They took out the on our knees. The editorial board did. It goes on to talk about how they went through a lot of hassles in order to get the 12 steps approved by the editorial board. Let's go to page 202. Right at the top of the page. This little fragment of history ought to convince the most skeptical that nobody invented Alcoholics Anonymous. It just grew by the grace of God. Now, it's obvious to me, and may not be to you, but it's obvious to me that Bill knew that when he wrote these 12 steps, he was acting under inspiration from a higher power. And I believe that to be true, absolutely. Who'd like to share?
I'm Paul, not Paul.
Yes, Paul.
I was listening. Well, I've listened to it a couple times. Just the other day, I was listening to Bill Wilson's CD where he was talking to a group the night that Dr. Bob died, and he talked about the night that he had that he had written down the steps, and up until that time, people would ask him, how does it work? How does it work? And they would say it works just fine because they didn't know. They just really passed through word of mouth, just like it says in here. And there's an interesting little story that he tells. It says here that he was dejected and suffering from one of his imaginary ulcer attacks. And he tells it in the story why he was dejected, like what happened. They were sitting around his living room discussing the direction that the book was going to take. And they were really in the heat of this argument. And they were trying to decide whether it was going to take a more psychological approach and get a lot of science involved in the book. And they had just had the World's Fair, and that would make the book sell better if they did that. And, Lois came storming in and got real angry and kicked everybody out and said to Bill that you're going to get drunk, buddy, and because you forgot who got you sober. And then he went and laid down. And then she went storming upstairs, and he said he didn't want to follow her, but then he went and laid down, and then he wrote the 12 steps out. But that's just a little interesting piece that I thought was pretty
Well,
funny.
thanks, Paul. The 200 words which are changing the world. Amazing, huh? Just came flowing out in a half an hour. No more struggle, and there's something there for each of us to understand. We stop fighting anything or anybody. Don't struggle. Let God have His way. We do the things that we're supposed to do, but we can stop struggling. That's when stuff gets done. Who's next? I'd like you to meet our friend, my dear friend Maris, down at the end of the table. glad to have you with us tonight, Maris. Who's next? Okay, Janelle?
My name's Sean, I'm pregnant. And I just think that it's so amazing that this book was published with 12 steps, considering all of the opinions, just with AA in general, and the members, and how we have trouble deciding at business meetings over coffee at times. We're reduced to that this book was even able to materialize. And to me, that just says that, our message and the 12 steps of AA are God-given, and they're so good, and, they could have only come through a higher power, because I just can't fathom, like, all of us, and I know most of you, trying to get together and write something that we all agree upon, and can walk away feeling good about, and knowing that it has the message. And that's a miracle.
Yeah, this fellowship hung by very slender threads for a long time, and each one of those had to be followed through. And somewhere along the line, I'm absolutely convinced that God wanted this. He wanted it badly enough that He inspired people, in spite of their differences, to get together enough to get the job done. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here, and many of us would already be long gone and dead. There would have been no recovery from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body, from a dread disease which is incurable and invariably deadly. Amazing that we're here. Ivan, would you like to share with us tonight?
I'm particularly amazed. Yeah, same thing. I all came to be. It's no less than pride and inspiration. I was thinking back in my times with psychiatrists and how far they got with my difficulties. There was nothing to it. This psychiatrist didn't even touch what was bothering me. I got those 12 steps. Worked so good. Worked so well. It is miraculous. Some people seem to make out very well without this. They just have to show that you're safe. Diamond business is this. Thanks for letting me share.
Yeah, thanks, Ivan.
Question.
Yes.
How long, whatever happened to the army? When did they typically down?
Well, they changed their name to Moral Rearmament.
What is it?
Moral Rearmament.
Moral? Oh, they had to get different principles?
Well, the founder of the group in the United States quit after they did that. And I guess they're still around. I don't know. Ivan, do you know?
No, I was going to ask the question. Are they, is the Oxford group still dealing with alcoholics?
Well,
were the people that the Oxford group dealt with, were they the alcoholics of the hopeless variety?
well, some of the people stayed with them. For example, Roland Hazard was a member of OG when he got to Ebby and when Ebby got to Bill, and Roland's biographer suggested he stayed with the Oxford group until his death, which was sometime in the 50s. So apparently there were people who stuck with them, but I don't know that there's much known about them after the big book was written, and the group in Akron was pretty well sold on OG, and they kind of stayed around with them for a while, but that finally faded out. And what happened to alcoholics within OG after that, I don't know. However, they had proven that their 6 steps were sufficient for recovery, but not sufficient, and here was the problem. Their 6 steps were not sufficient for continued sobriety, because their idea that you could become perfect was not working for our guys. They found out you couldn't. They had to have tools to use for the rest of their lives, and that's where the 10th step came from, because they found out that the world and all of its people would continue to threaten them, and therefore their defects would crop back up, and therefore they needed to have tools to use in order to deal with that, and that's where the 10th step came from. Who's next?
What happened to Betty?
Well, Ebby had kind of a spotty recovery. He was in and out a lot, and I don't remember whether he died sober or not. I can't. I heard it one time, but I'm not. There is a book about him, and I've never read it. Marilyn, do you know?
Yeah, Tommy said she was at Ebby's funeral, and that he was that Bill wanted everybody to know that he was 2 years sober.
Oh, okay, good. See, I didn't know that.
Tommy was at the funeral.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Ah, well, that's good to know. But he really struggled with it, and I don't think he ever embraced the AA program at all. I think he stuck with the OGs, because remember his mentor was Roland Hazard, and every indication that Roland stayed with OG. So I would imagine that's why Ebby did. Ebby was reputed to be Bill's sponsor, but that's really not true. Bill used as a sponsor Father Ed Dowling, who was a Jesuit priest from St. Louis. And from 1940 to 1960, Father Ed was the closest thing Bill had to a sponsor. And most of their contact was by letters. And there is a book out, which is a collection, in part at least, a collection of the letters between the two of them. Especially important to read the letters that Bill wrote when he was writing the 12 and 12, because he was depending almost entirely on Father Ed to advise him. And Father Ed had tremendous input into the 12 and 12. And as a matter of fact, reputed to have written the 6th and 7th steps, or at least a full outline, which Bill put into his own language. But Father Ed was not an alcoholic. He was instrumental in starting AA in St. Louis, but he was a very strong Catholic, as most Jesuits are. And Bill was so influenced by Father Ed that he wanted to become a Catholic. And he went to the Archbishop in New York to take instruction, but he found that there were some things that the Catholics required him to believe that he could not believe, so he was not able to become a Catholic, but he tried to do so. It was also about this time, he writes about it in back and forth to Father Ed. He was experimenting with LSD during this time, and he was in very severe depression and suicidal for about 3 years, about the same time as writing the 12 and 12, which is, in my opinion anyway, accounts for so many discrepancies in that book, and the way in which it totally ignores the directions for working the steps and simply philosophizes a lot about them without in any way showing us how to work them. All the directions for working steps are in the big book. Maris.
I think Joe not closing in here. I find this to be really interesting in here. And what it's talking about is how Ebby's obsession was listed, which is kind of cool because they didn't have the 12 steps back then. You hear a lot in the media, like you hear a lot of people talk about like sober and obsession. It's not listed from them. But it says in here, it says being an alcoholic was rather on the obstinate side, he hadn't been able to buy all the obstinacy ideas and attitudes. Nevertheless, he was moved by their deep sincerity and felt mighty grateful for the fact that their administrations had, for a time being, listed the obsession to drink. It said he kept repeating these things. I found I couldn't run my life on my own. I had to be honest with myself and someone else. I had to make restitution for damage I had done, and I had to pray to God for guidance and strength, even though I wasn't sure there was any God. After I tried hard to do these things, I had found that my craving of alcohol left. It says you don't fight the desire to drink anymore. You become the Lostness. You get released from it. You've never had such a feeling. I think that's really cool because that's like 4 things out of 6 in the Alfred group in the obsession. We've got 12 today, yet people don't get the obsession listed.
That's
really neat, I think.
Yeah, well, and that's very significant, Maris. Thanks for pointing it out, because when you read those things, what was Ebby in fact doing in terms of the big book itself? He was seeking God, wasn't he? And what does the third pertinent idea tell us? Could and would what? We lead us to the obsession, compulsion to drink, right? So Ebby found out something which is memorialized now in the big book, that God will remove the obsession, compulsion to drink when we seek Him. And so that this does not connote a complete recovery. It talks about the removal of the obsession, and the compulsion, which frees us up then to do the work necessary to fit ourselves to be a maximum service to God. But that's what Ebby found, and it just simply translated over into that one little sentence in the 3 pertinent ideas: God can and will if we seek Him. Ivan?
I agree with their idea of perfection and trying to get human beings, to be perfect. If I was trying to get to be perfect, I would continually be in a state of guilt, remorse, and shame. Because there's no way that I'm perfect. There's no way that I won't make mistakes daily. And if I was in a group who had some idea that perfection was attainable, I'd be in a continuous state of guilt, remorse, and shame.
Sure, and that's
I would not be able to survive.
You're absolutely right, and we read in the Bible that there was no sin until there was the law. Until there's something for us to break, we don't have sin. When you lay down the rules of recovery and you make it a condition of recovery that you become perfect, but you don't reach perfection, you're breaking the law. And that's sin. It's a pretty interesting parallel, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Ivan. That's good.
Under those conditions, I would recommend shortly.
And Jean.
I just wanted to make an observation of what Nancy said. Because she was saying, I was sitting there and I was thinking when she was reading that, it went through my head that I can remember the exact moment when I was at the refrigerator. I was detoxing myself at home off of a lot of drugs. And I had I had had a whole Xanax in my hand, and I broke it in half, and I gave the other half to my husband. I said, just let me take a half, or I'm going to a seizure.
Did you give it to him so he could take the other half?
Yeah, no, he probably, I'm sure he needed it. But I can remember, I had like that, I changed, something in me changed, because then I wasn't seeking the drugs or the alcohol. I was moving in an entirely different direction. I just didn't know what was ahead of me. But I knew that what I was praying to please God help me.
Yeah.
And I hadn't started amends, I hadn't started anything, but I knew I didn't want that direction anymore, that I wanted, the direction to seek. And that God was the only one that could help me.
Mm-hmm.
And that was way before I read the big book, way before I was only going to a couple meetings. But I knew this is where I belong.
And you were right, weren't you?
Thank God I was.
Yeah. Thank God you're here. Ivan?
That's what I call the guilt of desperation.
Yeah.
That's the guilt from God. Trusting in God.
No doubt about that. Yeah.
Only thing I think I had twice.
Jim, I'm Howard, and I'm a member of AA.
Hi, Howard.
And just a few comments, I guess, observations.
Sure, please.
It's interesting to me, at least, that in 30 minutes, it seems like it must have been God just working right through Bill's hand to be able to put down these great principles that you think that you'd be thinking for years to be able to do that. And in 30 minutes, he was able to do that. The only time I've ever had clarity like that was after my parents had passed away, that I had to write a eulogy where you're just so emotionally drained that it just flows from the heart. There isn't thinking. It just comes together and it just gets down on paper. And it's interesting to me to be able to watch where Bill stepped off the carousel and was able to say, wait a second, I feel like when we're drugging or drinking or sex or eating or gambling or any of these things to remove us truly from our feelings, as you were saying before in the earlier discussion group, think about this for a second, because I do. We're young and we're growing up. The Ten Commandments, thou shalt honor your mother and father. If they're fighting, or mom is drinking, or dad is drinking, or someone's having an affair, I mean, wait a minute, that's all pretty confusing, yet you're still supposed to be in a loving home. Well, that's already distorting your reality. You love them, well, how can you? They're hitting each other, they're drinking, and there's fighting going on. So you start to distort your reality as a little guy. And then as you're growing up, if you don't start to have the real communication in your house, you're dead. Because you really start to distort and don't believe your own reality. And if you grow up doing that, then what you're doing is doubting yourself. And I know I did that, and I think many others have done that too, if you really go back and look at it. And then running and running and running then only became another way of running from what I knew as a kid, because it never made sense. And then all the running and the drugging and the drinking and all the stuff was only a means of trying to protect myself from the pain and the confusion of what was there from many, many, many years ago. And I think a lot of that is very common through all the addictions, which I define as any chemical or behavior to run away from feelings. And yet these people were able to, I think, have a lot of the same underlying pains and fears and resentments that I'm sure I have right now, but they stepped off the merry-go-round and the carousel and then put into motion a lot of principles that could also help me and us be able to take a look at it and say, it can help us too. And that's truly remarkable. They too were in a big battle, and were able to step outside the battle and be able to say, wait a minute, here's a way to be able to overcome and win this battle. Continue fighting, and you too will be able to survive the battle. That to me is astonishing. And what kept them together was this tremendous. It's like when the guys go through the Marine Corps, they go through any battle or the SEALs or anything like that. There's such a camaraderie that one for all and all for one, but it's better for the group to continue to survive than it is for any one of us to have a big ego and be up at the top of the hill. It's much better for the group as a whole, and I think that that's probably what was happening. And then with the glue of God, it continued to work. Thank God for all of us.
Yeah.
That's what I think.
Thank you. Well, you know, it was inspired genius for Bill to write these down, because once they were on paper, it was very hard for the dissidents to do anything about it. They were already there. They only changed 2 of the steps. They changed the 12th step from spiritual experience to spiritual awakening, and from he tried to carry this message to others, especially alcoholics. They changed that to carry this message to alcoholics. They changed the 7th step, where Bill had written humbly on our knees. They took out the on our knees, but they didn't change anything else. And those steps have never been changed since then. But once they were in writing and they were down in front of them, all the dissidents had to back off. Because if they were going to be successful in changing the substance of what Bill wrote, they were going to have to rewrite the things themselves. They would have to try to do that. And so it just, they satisfied themselves finally with the so-called Appendix 2, which was added to the second printing of the first edition, wasn't in the first printing. And that was a matter of compromise, because they wanted to soften what they consider to be the religious approach of the Big Book. And they did get their shot in, because in that Appendix 2, talking about God consciousness, it says, our more religious members call it God consciousness. It's a very snide comment. Whereas the Big Book says that all of us become God conscious. And of course that's the truth of it. So, and they also took Bill on his bright light experience, even though the Big Book says 3 times that God comes to most people slowly, but for Bill it was sudden. And so they made a lot of that, saying that, well, everybody's going to be confused here. They're going to think they have to have an epiphany in order to recover, and so we're going to spend a couple of pages explaining to them that's not necessarily so. So that's where that thing came from. But if you look back and you see where they were struggling to express themselves and to get the group to write a book which would stay away from God, stay away from higher power, and talk about psychic changes and that kind of stuff, and they were not successful doing it. And the one place they could really have hurt us would have been if they had been successful with the steps. And until such time as Lois came down and said, "You damn fool, you're going to drink again. You're sitting here letting these people run all over you. You don't know what's going on. You're all depressed." And Bill, I guess at that point, couldn't help himself. It was time to write. And when he wrote, there it was. And there was God right up front in the second step and all the way through the steps. And the liberals were never able to do anything about that, because it was in front of them and it was in writing. We write stuff down. There's a little ditty that I like, which is my own kind of stupid thing. The more you write, the better you feel. The more you write, the better you feel. Write. Get out of your head. Get it down on paper. Then you can deal with it. Right, Maris?
Absolutely.
Absolutely right, Maris. Okay, guys, let's call it an evening.
When you get yeah, exactly.
You don't get to leave. The AA police will be at the door until we pay the rent. Let's let this circle represent the unity of our fellowship. A moment of silence for those who are still suffering, and we'll say the Lord's Prayer together. Please remember we don't say anything after we say amen. Thank you. Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Thanks all for being here. See you next week. God willing, the creek don't rise. And I'll see you guys
Tomorrow.
tomorrow.